Thanks for being here as the show continues. We were just talking with Allan Bonner a moment ago, and one of the things we were talking about is lessons learned. And it's hard to come up with those lessons when you're still in the middle of it, right? I mean, whether it's a big picture thing that we go through together as nations or as civilizations, or whether it's something that we go through as individuals, it's really hard in the midst of a crisis to ask yourself, what would I have done better or differently? It's very natural and human to ask yourself what you did to get yourself here, and that's a healthy instinct, even if not always a helpful one in the moment of crisis. But it's not often that you can have that conversation about how can we get out of this, or how could we have avoided this in the first place, or what could we have done differently and better, until you are through the problem. But it's never too early to start asking yourself some of those questions here. And I want to bring on someone whose job it is to do this. Allan Bonner has been a guest here on the show before, and it's a pleasure to talk with him now. He's an emergency planning and a crisis response expert, and he's been working with Johns Hopkins University on this issue, on this pandemic, since it's been grinding on here. And Allan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think what you've been looking at is the issue of early warning. What could the scientific community possibly have done to communicate to not only the government, but probably also the public, that this was something that was coming our way? Some of us saw it coming early. A lot of us were caught completely by surprise when it hit hard in March. How could we do better next time?
Well, I think you've described that well, Matt, and the way the academics describe it is, get ready for the multisyllables, translational epidemiology, or consequential epidemiology. And all that means is the word consequence. What is the end result of this study that we are doing, or how does it translate into making people healthier and generating more wellness? So, I mean, does it do any good is what we're asking. We have been, for the past 100 years in science, finding out more and more minute measurements in parts per quadrillion, and we don't know what to do with that information. The public doesn't understand it. We're not even sure in terms of health outcomes whether it matters at all. But let's take a broad example. Don't touch your face. Okay, great advice. Don't touch your face. You wouldn't need to study which digit is touched by which demographic group and which part of the face to make that advice more useful. It's just don't touch your face. But then when you are also told to cough into your sleeve, you are actually touching your face. Now, you know, smart people like you and Arlene and the people listening to this program say, "Oh, come on, you're being silly about this." But remember the 25% of the population that doesn't consume the news media much, the people who are staying home with children in normal times and are not consuming the media, people with English as a second language. Those two messages may sound really contradictory. And then you get the mask. Wear a mask for yourself, wear a mask for others, wear a type of mask. The mask will help you not touch your face. Hey, has anybody ever worn a mask? It's itchy, and it makes you want to touch your face. And then don't touch the outside of the mask because it could have the virus on it. So the information is rather confusing, and it is Johns Hopkins' goal to try to make this less confusing and more usable. And just one more thing on my filibuster, Matt. You rightly said it's hard to adjust when you're in the middle of doing something. But you know, as a journalist, sometimes in mid-sentence in electronic journalism, and certainly in mid-sentence in print, you can change directions and make that sentence better. So, you know, sometimes we can adjust the course in mid-course.
And I think what you're saying here has been really very true, and we've seen it in Canada. And I'm not saying this to pick on anyone, Allan. I know that there's been enough criticism aimed at certain officials. But one of the interesting things all over the world is exactly what you're talking about here. We have seen that other countries and other jurisdictions or even other institutions are better at this than others are. And for whatever reason, it seems that our federal, and again, I'm not saying this to get into partisan criticism here, but we've seen other health agencies in other parts of the world, including Europe, the United States, parts of Asia, have probably been better at making those mid-sentence pivots and better at reacting to evolving information. Whereas in Canada, for instance, we had masks being recommended in Europe, in Asia, and the United States, and we were really, really slow on that. And then eventually, oh yeah, okay, we've decided to go ahead with masks. And I don't know if that is a research delay in Canada. I don't know if it's a communications delay in Canada. I honestly don't even know if it's a bureaucratic delay in Canada, where it just takes longer for us to make decisions in our institutions. But what you're talking about here, translating knowledge into information for the public, this has been a known problem for us here in Canada. And, you know, overall, I'm lucky to be in this country. We have avoided some of the major problems we've seen elsewhere, and thank God for that. But we have obviously seen some weaknesses in our own public health response in this country, and I think communications has been a big part of that.
Well, you bet. Look what the great Dr. Fauci, and I'm not using the great in any ironic way, he is a great public servant. He explained that no need to wear the mask occurred not only because we didn't have complete information, and you know the expression, it's not a science. Well, in one of my science degrees, we learned that science isn't a science. Real life doesn't happen in a laboratory. It doesn't happen with white coats on. 2,4-D, 2,4,5-T are used out in a farmer's field in the dark with people who can't read English and no light. So science is great, but how does it translate into the real world? Anyway, Dr. Fauci said this was said when information was in the process of forthcoming about the mask, but also there was a shortage of masks. And that makes surely a lot of members of the public say, oh, well, I guess healthcare workers are more important than the average person. And that is a bad message, I think, to be delivering. Or I think a lot of people would be justified in saying, oh, they don't really know. And that is a dangerous thing, too, because then when the healthcare system and healthcare officials and public officials cry wolf a few times, when it is really life-threatening to go out or do something, maybe the public won't listen.
No, and that is definitely going to be an issue here. And I think in this particular case right now, we're getting what all the experts agree is critical public health information from our governments here, but stuff that really runs counter to our preferences. Like, we're not supposed to see our families right now. Like, I haven't really been able to see, or we've stood on their yard basically and spoken to my parents, and that's been 2 months. So my kids have not been able to hug their grandparents in months, and we're doing that because the public health experts are telling us not to do that. People are limiting travel. They're avoiding important parts of their normal routine. Business owners are seeing their lifetime investments go up in smoke because of the economic shutdown. And we're doing this. We're complying because we have faith in the public authorities. But exactly as you just said, when those public authorities make decisions or belated announcements that erode the faith, it's not going to be long before people start going, if the person can't even make up their mind about masks, why am I going to keep believing them about the fact that I can't reopen my store or go visit my in-laws or something?
Yes, Matt, and that is going to be absolutely positively life-threatening. Let me suggest at least some rays of hope. I do visit my grandchildren very rarely, because a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old cannot be restrained from wanting to hug granddad. They have not yet learned that I'm not all that likable a guy. They will eventually, just like my teenage boys did. But we can stay 6 feet apart and do some exercises, or hockey sticks, and or a soccer ball, kick a ball back and forth. So we can think of things to do that are almost normal life. And next, the studies, and they are scientific studies, that children are usually asymptomatic. There are scientific reasons why, because of the development of their lungs and their bodies. So they could be easily carriers, and the most famous carrier in the world who was unsymptomatic was Typhoid Mary. So those kids could infect other people. Secondly, we are not doing anything in the public sphere that I can see to try to open up the economy safely. For example, I did business in Japan years ago. 20 years ago, you could buy wonderful hot coffee, milk and sugar, double, any kind of coffee you wanted in a can on a vending machine in the street. I heard that it was Canadian technology. If I were the mayor, I would say let's get those strategically placed outside of Tim Hortons, Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, wherever, so that people aren't lining up. I mean, I used to think it was crazy doing business in Ottawa and seeing 75 civil servants lined up behind the Starbucks and, one of the government buildings. I mean, it's a waste of time anyway, and we could do that. I've advised my dry cleaner, who was a great guy, and by the way, I am offering to pay all my bills. We have to do that. Put a table out in the sidewalk. Let's allow that. Have an emergency bylaw. Table out in the sidewalk. Hooks for the clothes. A tap on the machine for your credit card payment, and that would be a safer way to do that kind of business. And one small possible ray of hope. There's an economist named Cohen, for people who like looking up these things, who studied the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska, which is where I began my emergency response and crisis management career, not in Alaska, but with the responders down south. He studied it and said there may actually be a net benefit to the economy in an emergency because of the massive spending. So if we start selling masks and gloves at a great rate and other necessaries, hand sanitizers, etc., that will be a net benefit to the economy. I'm not saying it's going to take the place of the auto sector, but I'm saying that the economy is still functioning in that sphere.
I think, as anything else, Alan, and we've basically run out the clock here, so I'll have to let you go on this. But within anything else, this is going to accelerate some trends that were already happening. So some businesses that were struggling will probably never recover. And for a whole bunch of other people, they're going to have ideas. They're going to build that proverbial better mousetrap, and they're going to go out and they're going to thrive on this. And hopefully the inequalities don't shake out in a way that causes political problems, but it will be interesting, to put it mildly. Alan, I am glad you're keeping well. I'm glad those sons you've mentioned are well as well. And we'll talk with you again soon, man. But in the meantime, keep up the great work.
You bet. Stay safe.
Take care. Allan Bonner, an emergency response and crisis reaction expert, my guest here on the show.